Mr. Bliss by JRR Tolkien. A note about the author. You may recognize the author's name, JRR Tolkien, from Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. This is another story that he told his children. It was recently uncovered and had not previously been published. All the illustrations in this book are also done by Mr. Tolkien. Mr. Bliss. Mr. Bliss lived in a house. It was a white house with red roofs. It had tall rooms and a very high front door, because Mr. Bliss wore such tall hats. He had rows of them on rows of pegs in the hall. One day, Mr. Bliss looked out the window early in the morning. "Is it going to be a fine day?" he asked the Jirabbit, which he kept in the garden, but its head often looked in at the bedroom windows. "Of course it is," said the Jirabbit. All days were fine to him, for his skin was of mackintosh, and he made a deep, deep hole in the ground, and he was blind, so he never knew whether the sun was shining or not. As a matter of fact, he usually went to bed after breakfast and got up for supper, so that he knew very little about the daytime. After breakfast, Mr. Bliss put on his green top hat, because the Jirabbit said it was going to be a fine day. Then he said, "I will go and buy a motor car." So he got on his bicycle and rode down the hill to the village. He walked into the shop and said, "I want a motor car." "What color?" said Mr. Binks. "Bright yellow," said Mr. Bliss, "inside and out." "That will be 5 shillings," said Mr. Binks. "And I want red wheels," said Mr. Bliss. "That will be 6 pence more." "Very well," said Mr. Bliss, only I have left my purse at home." "Very well, then you will have to leave your bicycle here, and when you bring your money, you can have it back." It was a beautiful bicycle, all silver, but it had no pedals, because Mr. Bliss only rode downhill. Mr. Bliss's motor car. Mr. Bliss got into the motor car and started off. Soon he asked himself, "Where are you going to, Mr. Bliss?" "I don't know, Mr. Bliss," he answered himself. "Let's go and visit the Dorkinses and give them a surprise." "Very well," said Mr. Bliss to himself. "Very well." So he turned sharp to the right at the next turning and ran straight into Mr. Day, coming from his garden with a barrel load of cabbages. This shows what happened. So he had to pick up Mr. Day and put the cabbages on the back of the motor car. Mr. Day said he was too bruised to walk. Now he went on again and turned sharp round the second turning to the left, and ran slap into Mrs. Knight, with her donkey cart piled with bananas. The cart was smashed. So he had to pile the bananas on top of the cabbages, and Mrs. Knight on top of Mr. Day, and tie the donkey on behind the car. The car was now very full, and would not go very fast. Soon they came into the wood, because the wood ran through the middle of it. Of course, the bears came out, and stood in the middle of the road and waved their arms. Archie, and Teddy, and Bruno. So Mr. Bliss had to stop, because he could not get by without running over them. "I like bananas," said Teddy. "And I like cabbages," said Archie. "And I want a donkey," said Bruno. "And we all want a motor car," they all said together. "But you can't have this motor car. It's mine," said Mr. Bliss. "And you can't have these cabbages. They're mine," said Mr. Day. "And you can't have these bananas or this donkey. They are mine," said Mrs. Knight. "Then we shall eat you all up, one each," said the bears. Of course, they were only teasing, but they rolled their yellow eyes and growled, and looked so fierce that Mr. Bliss was frightened, and so was Mr. Day and Mrs. Knight. So they gave the bears the cabbages and the bananas. Archie and Teddy piled them on the donkey and took them away to their house in the wood. Bruno sat and talked to Mr. Bliss. Really, he was watching to see Mr. Bliss did not drive away before Archie and Teddy came back. When they came back, the bear said, "Now we want a motor ride." "But I am going to see the Dorkinses," said Mr. Bliss, "and you don't know them." "But we could know them," said Archie. So Mr. Bliss had to let them all get in at the back, and there was such a squash that Mrs. Knight had to sit in front by Mr. Bliss, and he was so squeezed he could hardly steer. Then they started off again and came out of the wood to the top of the hill, because the road ran straight up it and down the other side. Mr. Bliss's motor car is drawn, both going up the hill and rushing down the other side. The poor donkey was tied on behind again. He did not mind much at first, because with 6 inside the motor, they did not go very fast uphill. But when they came to the top of the hill and began to go down, because the Dorkinses lived at the bottom, it was very different. Mr. Bliss was so squeezed by Mrs. Knight, he could not put on the brakes. Soon they began to whiz, and the donkey was dragged flying through the air. Faster and faster they ran, until they crashed plump into the Dorkinses' garden wall. They all shot out headfirst and flew over the wall, all except the donkey, who turned a somersault in the car, like this. The cabbages and bananas are not in the picture, of course. The bears had hidden them all in the wood. The Dorkinses were the other side of the wall, sitting on their beautiful lawn on little stools. They were eating soup out of little bowls, and their lovely carpet was spread on the grass. They were fat people, but one of them was specially fat. And he was known as the Fat Dorkins, or just Fatty. He had curly black hair and wore no coat, because he split coats when he tried to get into them. So he went about in a white shirt with yellow spots and no sleeves. The second fattest Dorkins, who is called Albert, is on the left. His legs were very short. Herbert is the one on the far side of the soup tureen. He looks so horrified because he has just swallowed a beetle that got into his soup. Egbert is the one with the green jacket. He also looks cross because there is another beetle on the lovely carpet. You can see he is just going to smack it with his spoon. But Albert looked much more horrified a second later, and the beetle was squashed very flat. Not by Egbert. It was just then that Mr. Bliss and all his party fell out of the sky onto the Dorkinses, the soup, the beetle, and the lovely carpet.